A disturbing story out of the UK. It appears that atrial fibrillation cases have skyrocketed in the country. It now appears that it is now 1 in 45 Britons who are now living with a condition. Now, atrial fibrillation, otherwise known as A-fib, for those who may not know, is an irregular and often very rapid heart rhythm, or arrhythmia, that can lead to blood clots in the heart. A-fib increases the risk of stroke, heart failure, and other heart-related complications. So this rise is quite concerning. And so we're going to discuss what is going on here. And so from Trial Site News, I am Adrian, and our episode is starting right now. So the question arises, why is the number of people in the UK diagnosed with atrial fibrillation surging 50% in just a decade, totaling 1.5 million today? This means that 1 in 45 people in the UK are now living with this condition. This diagnosed heart condition raises the risk of stroke, this according to the British Heart Foundation. And the surge is based on a 50% rise from 2013, at the time 1 million, to today. But the report, however, doesn't identify any year-to-year trends, which seems like a rather interesting omission here. So what is the culprit behind the surge? Is it a lifestyle and growing health challenges in the population? What about the impact of the SARS-CoV-2 caused pandemic? Or what about the mass vaccination scheme? In what by now has become extremely unsurprising, these topics are ignored by the British Heart Foundation. Because why would we study that? Now, people with this diagnosis of A-fib are 5 times more likely to succumb to a fatal or life-changing stroke. Atrial fibrillation is the most common form of abnormal heart rhythm and is believed to contribute to 1 in 5 strokes. According to the British Heart Foundation, they estimate that there is at least another 270,000 people in the UK that are undiagnosed or unaware of their condition. The authors of the study are suggesting that there is a need for improved recognition and diagnosis of the condition. The cardiovascular-focused charity calls out for more research to help find new and better ways to identify people who are at risk of atrial fibrillation so that they can be diagnosed earlier. While prevalent symptoms of atrial fibrillation include palpitations, breathlessness, and dizziness, many others, however, don't experience any symptoms, meaning that they are unaware of the condition and treatments, as well as their increased risk of stroke. The recent piece by the British Heart Foundation points out that AF can also be intermittent, increasing the challenge of identifying those who have it. BHF Medical Director Professor Sir Nilesh Samani reports, these figures show a quite astonishing rise in the number of people diagnosed with atrial fibrillation. Research has helped us understand the links between atrial fibrillation and stroke, and that has spurred the efforts we have seen in recent years to identify people with this potentially dangerous heart rhythm. What remains troubling is the sheer number of people who are undiagnosed and unaware that they are living with a heightened risk of stroke. Finding people with this hidden threat must remain a priority. We also need to continue to harness the power of science to develop new and innovative tools for identifying people at increased risk of developing atrial fibrillation so we can try and prevent the condition developing or at least identify people earlier if they develop it, as there are effective treatments available to reduce their risk. But now the question arises, what about COVID-19? Is it a factor behind this surge? And what about the mass vaccination program? COVID-19 infections can lead to A-fib. There have been numerous reports and studies, as well as declarations from health systems on this subject. According to medical evidence website Up to Date, patients with COVID-19 may be at increased risk of certain arrhythmias. Factors such as severity of illness and taking specific medications for COVID-19 treatment may increase the risk of developing arrhythmia. Atrial fibrillation in a large United States registry of nearly 31,000 patients hospitalized with COVID-19, they found that 5.4% developed new onset atrial fibrillation during their index hospitalization. In a separate meta-analysis of 19 observational studies with 21,653 patients hospitalized with COVID-19, the prevalence of A-fib was 11%. And A-fib was higher in patients with severe versus non-severe COVID-19, 19 versus 3%. So the next question then is, what about the COVID-19 vaccines? The React-19 post-COVID-19 vaccine serious adverse event repository includes a handful of A-fib cases associated with the COVID-19 vaccination. A group of researchers led by Dr. Deshmukh in the Department of Cardiovascular Medicine at the Mayo Clinic back in June of 2022 conducted a review of the CDC's Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, otherwise known as VAERS, finding some incidents of A-fib after COVID-19 vaccination, notably associated with the mRNA vaccines. However, the overall incidence of atrial fibrillation after COVID-19 vaccination was, quote, low. They did note that older vaccine recipients were more likely to have A-fib. While cardiac adverse events are reportedly uncommon, there remains limited data on atrial fibrillation after receiving COVID-19 vaccination. Now, the study authors said that they sought to analyze publicly available data from the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System to determine the incidence and factors associated with A-fib after COVID-19 vaccination. They found a total of 2,611 events of A-fib that were reported after COVID-19 vaccination, of which 315 were new-onset atrial fibrillation. As of January 7, 2022, there was a total of 523.12 million COVID-19 vaccine doses that were administered, making the incidence of atrial fibrillation around 5 per million COVID-19 vaccine doses administered. And yet, just a few months after this study was posted, we find a new study posted to medRxiv which shows a bit different picture. This study covered an overall incidence of arrhythmia from 36 studies, which involved 1.5 million vaccine doses. And they found that it was 291.8 cases per million doses. The incidence of arrhythmia was significantly higher after COVID-19 vaccination cases per million doses than after non-COVID-19 vaccination cases per million doses. Compared with COVID-19 vaccines, the influenza, pertussis, human papillomavirus, and acellular pertussis vaccines were associated with significantly lower incidence of arrhythmia. Now, the study authors concluded that the overall risk for arrhythmia after COVID-19 vaccination was relatively low, although it was higher in COVID-19 vaccine recipients than in non-COVID-19 vaccine recipients. This increased risk should be evaluated along with other important factors, such as the incidence of local outbreaks and the risk for arrhythmia due to COVID-19 infection itself, when weighing the safety and efficacy of COVID-19 vaccines. Now, it is also interesting to note that the UK, which just went through a pandemic due to a pathogen that could in cases trigger A-fib, followed by a mass vaccination program using products that, according to health officials and organizations like the World Health Organization, can cause, quote, on rare occasions, afibrillation themselves. And yet no mention of either in most reports on the subject matter. Which of course begs the question, why? Shouldn't such an increase in cases like this garner more interest in discovering all potential factors driving such a rise in cases? It does seem odd, doesn't it? Now, in any case, we here at Trial Site News will of course be keeping an eye on this story as it moves forward, and we will certainly update you once more information becomes available. And that, my friends, will bring our episode to a close once more. For more content like this, be sure to check back to this channel daily, Monday through Friday, or for written articles published every day, 7 days a week, feel free to check us out at trialsitenews.com. And as always, my friends, thank you so much for joining me on the program today. From Trial Site News, I am Adrian, and I will see you all next time.